If dignity belongs only to the powerful, a calm voice would one day say, then power has already forgotten its purpose. Evelyn Carter kept her eyes fixed on the weathered stone beneath her knees as the cold surface pressed through the thin fabric of her faded gray dress. Around her, nearly 300 wolves filled the moonfall square, their silence heavier than the iron bell hanging above the ancient judgment platform. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and would smoke through Iron Ridge Pack, yet none of it could wash away the weight of humiliation hanging in the air. She could feel every stare without lifting her head. Some carried pity, others curiosity, but most held the quiet satisfaction reserved for someone the world had already decided did not belong. 3 years earlier, they had called her the Quiet Omega. Then they called her the Broken Omega. Eventually, they stopped calling her by her name altogether. Today she was simply the example. Elder Magnus stepped onto the circular platform, his silver ceremonial cloak flowing behind him as the crowd instinctively straightened. Evelyn Carter, his voice echoed across the square. You stand accused of bringing dishonor upon this sacred gathering through your unworthy presence. The words drifted over her like cold rain. She had learned long ago that arguing only fed those who wanted to see her fall. Her fingers tightened against the stone, trembling not from fear alone, but from exhaustion after years of carrying burdens no one else noticed. Somewhere behind the front rows, children whispered questions their parents quickly silenced. Young wolves were taught early that strength deserved admiration, while weakness deserved distance. Evelyn had become the lesson every family pointed toward when warning their sons and daughters what failure looked like. High above the square, banners embroidered with silver wolves fluttered beneath the cloudy afternoon sky, reminding everyone that honor ruled this land. Yet honor felt strangely absent today. Bow your head, another elder ordered. Evelyn slowly lowered her chin. She refused to let tears fall. They had taken enough from her already. The crowd remained perfectly still until elegant footsteps crossed the polished stone. Lady Vivian Ashcroft, celebrated as the brightest daughter of the northern houses, offered a graceful smile that never reached her pale blue eyes. Some people, she said softly enough for everyone to hear, should remember their place before asking the moon goddess for blessings they never earned. Gentle laughter spread through the gathering like ripples across a quiet lake. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment. She remembered another afternoon years ago when she had found a wounded traveler alone beneath towering pines after a violent storm. His face had been hidden beneath mud and rain, his voice barely stronger than a whisper. She had shared her last piece of bread, wrapped his injured shoulder with strips torn from her own cloak, and disappeared before sunrise without asking his name. Sometimes she wondered if kindness vanished as quickly as footprints after rainfall. Remain where you are, Elder Magnus declared. You will kneel until judgment is complete. Evelyn inhaled slowly. The stone beneath her suddenly felt colder than before. Then something changed. It began not with a sound, but with a feeling, as though the wind itself had paused to listen. Birds resting along the rooftops lifted into the gray sky all at once. The banners stopped fluttering. Even the laughter faded into uneasy silence. Somewhere beyond the towering oak gates, measured footsteps echoed across the ancient road, steady and unhurried, carrying a presence so calm that every conversation died before another word could be spoken. Without anyone giving an order, wolves throughout the square instinctively stepped aside, creating a path through the crowd. Evelyn remained on her knees, unaware that every pair of eyes had shifted away from her and toward the solitary figure now walking into Moonfall Square. Evelyn did not look up because she had spent years teaching herself that hope often arrived wearing disappointment instead. Long before the whispers had followed her through every hallway and every marketplace, she had believed she belonged among the wolves of Iron Ridge. She had been only 16 when her mother passed away after a long winter illness, leaving behind nothing except a worn silver pendant and a single piece of advice. Kindness is never wasted, even when no one thanks you for it. Evelyn carried those words through every season that followed. While other young Omegas discovered the gifts that made them valuable to their packs, she discovered only silence. Her wolf never answered the moon goddess with the powerful awakening everyone expected. There was no brilliant display beneath the full moon, no surge of ancient strength, no remarkable talent that would earn admiration. The elders called it unfortunate. The younger wolves called it embarrassing. Before long, everyone simply treated her as though she were invisible until they needed someone to sweep the meeting hall, gather firewood, or deliver supplies through icy trails no one else wanted to walk. Yet she never refused. Every sunrise found her carrying baskets across the village, helping elderly neighbors repair fences before the first snowfall, or comforting frightened children during fierce thunderstorms. They accepted her kindness as naturally as they accepted the changing seasons, but few ever offered kindness in return. There had been one evening, however, that remained untouched by the bitterness of those years. A violent storm had rolled across the northern forest without warning, drenching every trail beneath sheets of cold rain. Evelyn had been returning from delivering medicine to an old widow nearly 8 miles beyond the village when she heard a horse crying somewhere between the towering pines. Following the sound, she discovered a dark stallion standing protectively beside an unconscious traveler whose heavy cloak had concealed nearly every feature except a pale hand resting against the soaked earth. His shoulder had been injured during the storm, and although he was breathing steadily, he had clearly been stranded for hours. Evelyn never stopped to wonder who he was. She tied the frightened horse beneath a sturdy oak, gathered dry branches from beneath thick evergreens, and built a small fire with practiced hands despite the rain. She tore a strip from her own cloak to secure fresh bandages around his shoulder, placed the last piece of bread from her satchel beside him, and covered him with her wool blanket before quietly preparing to leave. Just as she reached the edge of the clearing, she heard a weak voice behind her. "Why would you help someone you do not know?" Evelyn paused without turning around. "Because someone should." The answer came so naturally that she hardly realized she had spoken aloud. She continued walking until the storm swallowed the sound of her footsteps, believing she would never see the stranger again. She never learned his name. She never expected gratitude. She returned home the next morning to another list of chores and another day of quiet dismissal. Over the following years, that memory faded into something gentle and distant, like sunlight breaking through clouds for only a moment before disappearing again. Standing before the judgment platform now, surrounded by hundreds who believed she had nothing worth honoring, Evelyn could not have imagined that a forgotten act of compassion from 3 years earlier was slowly drawing the past and the present toward the same unforgettable moment. The mysterious arrival did not erase the ceremony. It only deepened the silence that surrounded it. Elder Magnus drew a slow breath, forcing confidence back into his voice as every eye remained fixed on the great oak gates. Whoever had entered the square had not yet spoken, and until the laws of the pack were interrupted, the judgment would continue. "The accused will remain in her place," he declared firmly. "No one is above the traditions of Ironridge." His words echoed across the ancient stone, but they no longer carried the same certainty. Evelyn stayed perfectly still, her knees aching against the cold ground while the wind brushed loose strands of chestnut hair across her face. She wished she could disappear into the gray afternoon sky. Instead, she heard familiar footsteps approach from her right. Lady Vivian stopped only a few feet away, her emerald cloak flowing gracefully as several noble families gathered behind her with carefully hidden smiles. "Look around, Evelyn," Vivian said softly. "This is what happens when someone forgets her place. You wanted respect, but respect is earned by strength, not by empty kindness." A few quiet chuckles drifted through the crowd. Evelyn closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. She knew arguing would accomplish nothing. Kindness had never won debates in Ironridge. It had only helped lonely people survive another day. Elder Magnus raised an ancient wooden staff carved with the symbols of the moon goddess. "Let all gathered here remember this lesson," he announced. "Compassion without value cannot sustain a pack. Weakness cannot lead. Every wolf must contribute according to the gifts they have been given." Evelyn felt the words settle over her shoulders like another invisible burden. She had heard similar speeches for years, yet today they somehow sounded heavier. Around the square, younger wolves watched carefully. Some appeared uncertain, while others nodded because every respected elder beside them did the same. It was easier to agree than to question, easier to follow than to think. A little girl standing beside her father quietly tugged at his sleeve. "Why is she alone?" she whispered. The father hesitated before answering in a voice barely above the breeze. "Because sometimes life is unfair. Those words reached Evelyn more clearly than the elder's proclamation. They did not sound cruel. They sounded tired. She wondered how many people secretly knew the truth, yet remained silent, because speaking carried its own cost. Elder Magnus extended one hand toward Evelyn. Bow lower before the sacred platform as a sign of repentance. Evelyn slowly lowered her head another inch. Her heartbeat remained steady even while disappointment settled quietly inside her chest. If this was the final memory the pack chose to keep of her, she wanted at least one thing to remain untouched. She would not allow bitterness to replace the compassion her mother had spent a lifetime teaching her. Just then, measured footsteps crossed the stone behind the gathered nobles. Slow, even, unhurried. No one announced the newcomer's name. No trumpet sounded. Yet one by one, conversations vanished. The elders stopped speaking. Noble families instinctively stepped backward. Experienced warriors straightened without realizing they had done so. An invisible pressure seemed to settle across Moonfall Square, not born from fear alone, but from the unmistakable presence of someone who carried authority without demanding it. Evelyn could sense the change, although she still refused to lift her eyes. She only noticed that the voices judging her had suddenly disappeared. Then another sound reached her ears. It was not applause, nor celebration. It was the quiet rustle of hundreds of people moving aside at once, creating a clear path across the square. Whoever had entered was now walking directly toward the place where she knelt, and with every calm step, the certainty of everyone who had condemned her seemed to grow just a little weaker. The figure finally emerged from the sea of parted wolves, and although Evelyn still kept her gaze lowered, she sensed the shift in the air as clearly as the arrival of winter after a warm autumn afternoon. Boots stopped several feet in front of the judgment platform. No one spoke. Even the restless banners hanging above Moonfall Square seemed to surrender to the stillness. Elder Magnus was the first to recover. He bowed deeply, joined almost instantly by every elder, warrior, merchant, and noble throughout the square. "Your Majesty," he said with measured respect, "we did not expect your arrival today." Alpha King Lucian Ashford answered with a calm nod rather than unnecessary ceremony. He wore a dark charcoal coat trimmed with silver thread that carried no extravagant ornaments despite his rank. His broad shoulders and quiet confidence commanded attention more effectively than any jeweled crown could have. His silver-gray eyes moved slowly across the gathering, observing faces rather than titles, expressions rather than appearances. He acknowledged no applause because none was offered. Reverence had replaced celebration. Lucian had ruled the Northern Territories for nearly a decade, earning a reputation unlike the exaggerated stories whispered by distant packs. Some described him as cold because he rarely wasted words. Others called him relentless because he demanded honesty from every leader beneath his authority. Yet among ordinary families, another reputation quietly endured. They believed the Alpha King listened before he judged. That belief alone had earned a loyalty no decree could command. His gaze settled briefly upon Elder Magnus. "Continue," he said evenly. The single word surprised nearly everyone present. The elder straightened, relief flickering across his face before he resumed the proceedings. "As you wish, Your Majesty. We are concluding disciplinary judgment concerning Evelyn Carter." Lucian did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his attention toward the lone Omega still kneeling before the platform. From where she remained, Evelyn could only see polished black boots stop a short distance away. She fought the temptation to lift her head. Every instinct urged her to remain exactly where she was. She had already become the center of enough unwanted attention. Lucian studied her quietly. The faded gray fabric of her dress showed careful repairs stitched by patient hands. Her sleeves had been mended more than once. Wind lifted loose strands of chestnut hair across her lowered face, yet she made no effort to brush them away. Even surrounded by judgment, she remained composed. There was no bitterness in her posture, only quiet endurance. A memory stirred unexpectedly within him. Rain falling through towering pines. A small fire struggling against the storm. A young woman placing her own blanket over an unconscious stranger before walking away without waiting for thanks. He remembered awakening to the scent of fresh bread resting beside him and the warmth of carefully wrapped bandages secured with torn pieces of worn gray cloth. For 3 years he had searched countless villages for the unknown woman whose kindness had asked for nothing in return. He had almost believed she existed only in memory until his royal scouts quietly reported that an Omega named Evelyn Carter was to stand before public judgment in Iron Ridge. Lucian had arrived before sunrise that morning, remaining unseen from a balcony overlooking the square while he watched every moment unfold without interruption. He had needed certainty. He wanted to see whether compassion still lived inside the woman who had once saved a nameless traveler and whether justice still lived inside the pack sworn to protect its own. The answers now stood plainly before him. One knelt in silence. The others stood comfortably around her. Without taking his eyes from Evelyn, Lucian spoke in the same calm voice that carried effortlessly across the motionless square. "Elder Magnus," he asked, "before this judgment reaches its conclusion, tell me one thing." Every heart seemed to pause with the wind itself. "What crime," he continued quietly, "has Evelyn Carter actually committed?" No one answered immediately. Elder Magnus, who had spoken with unwavering certainty only moments earlier, hesitated for the first time that afternoon. The silence stretching across Moonfall Square became almost tangible as hundreds of wolves waited for a response worthy of the Alpha King's question. Finally, the elder cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "Evelyn Carter has not violated a written law. However, her continued presence has repeatedly disrupted the harmony of this pack. She has failed to awaken her wolf, failed to fulfill the expectations placed upon an Omega, and has become the center of unnecessary unrest. The Council believes it is necessary to remind every member of their proper place." Lucian remained expressionless. "I asked what crime she committed," he repeated in the same calm voice. "You have described disappointment. You have described opinion. You have described expectation. I have not yet heard a crime." Several elders exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Vivian stepped forward before anyone else could answer, her graceful posture untouched by the growing tension. "Your Majesty," she said with respectful confidence, "leadership sometimes requires difficult examples. A pack survives because everyone understands order. When one person refuses to accept reality, others begin to question traditions that have protected us for generations." Lucian shifted his attention toward her without speaking. The noblewoman continued. "She inspires sympathy instead of discipline. Younger wolves watch her and begin believing that effort alone deserves honor. That belief weakens the structure of every family beneath this territory." A faint breeze swept across the square, carrying fallen leaves between polished stone paths. Lucian let several long moments pass before asking another question. "Has Evelyn Carter ever refused work assigned to her?" Elder Magnus slowly shook his head. "No, Your Majesty." "Has she stolen from this pack?" "No." "Has she harmed another member?" "No." "Has she betrayed Iron Ridge to an enemy?" "Certainly not." Lucian nodded once. "Then what I see before me is a woman who has remained loyal despite receiving very little loyalty in return." His words spread quietly through the gathering, not as an accusation, but as an observation impossible to dismiss. Evelyn remained motionless, struggling to understand why the Alpha King continued asking questions no one had ever asked on her behalf. She had expected judgment, not curiosity. Around the square, whispers cautiously returned. Some younger wolves lowered their eyes as memories surfaced of small acts they had witnessed over the years. Evelyn carrying supplies through snow while others stayed indoors. Evelyn repairing an elderly widow's fence after a spring storm. Evelyn comforting frightened children during nights filled with thunder. None of those moments had seemed important at the time. Together, however, they painted a picture very different from the one repeated by the Council. Lucian noticed the changing expressions throughout the crowd. Perception was shifting, quietly, naturally, not because he demanded it, but because truth often required only a single honest question to expose years of comfortable assumptions. He looked once more toward the woman still kneeling on the cold stone. She had not interrupted anyone. She had not pleaded for mercy. She had not defended herself even when every voice around her had spoken against her. That silence revealed more strength than many warriors displayed during public celebrations. Lucian took one slow step forward, then another. Every movement drew the attention of the entire square. He stopped directly before Evelyn, close enough that she could hear his steady breathing above the whisper of the wind. Without raising his voice, he spoke words that no one present had expected to hear. "Evelyn Carter," he said gently, "after everything they have said about you today, I would like to hear something they never thought to ask. Tell me, in your own words, what happened?" For several long seconds, Evelyn could not answer. Not because she did not know the truth, but because no one had ever asked for it. She slowly lifted her eyes just enough to meet Lucian's steady gaze. There was no impatience there, no judgment, only quiet attention. She drew a careful breath. "I did not refuse anyone," she said softly. "I did not argue with the council. I only asked why helping others could be considered a burden to the pack." Her voice remained gentle, yet every word carried across the silent square. "Last month, I gave part of my winter food to the Miller family after their harvest failed. I stayed with Mrs. Harper when she became ill because her sons were away. I repaired the school roof after the spring storm because rain was falling onto the children's desks. I thought those things mattered." She paused, lowering her eyes again. "Perhaps I was wrong." No one laughed. The silence that followed felt different from before. It was no longer filled with contempt. It was filled with reflection. Lucian studied her expression carefully. She was not defending herself to preserve her pride. She genuinely believed she had somehow failed despite spending years placing others before herself. Elder Magnus folded his hands behind his back. "Good intentions alone cannot determine the future of a pack," he insisted. "Leadership requires strength." Lucian turned toward him. "Strength," he repeated thoughtfully. "An interesting word." He slowly looked across the gathered wolves. "Tell me, who among you received kindness from Evelyn Carter?" At first, no one moved. Then an elderly woman leaning upon a carved wooden cane stepped forward from the third row. "She repaired my fence after the winter winds," Mrs. Harper said quietly. "She refused payment." Another voice answered from farther back. "She helped deliver my daughter during the blizzard because the healer could not reach our cabin," a middle-aged farmer admitted. A schoolteacher raised her hand next. "The children still use the books she rescued before the roof collapsed." One memory became another, then another. A merchant remembered Evelyn returning a lost purse untouched. A widow recalled warm meals left anonymously on her porch. Even one of the younger warriors lowered his head before speaking. "She stayed with my little brother after he became separated during the harvest festival until we found him." Each confession arrived without hesitation, as though people suddenly realized they had remained silent far too long. Lady Vivian's composed smile slowly disappeared. She glanced toward the elders, searching for reassurance, but found only uncertainty. The story they had repeated for years was quietly unraveling through the voices of ordinary people. Lucian allowed every testimony to settle over the square before taking one final step toward Evelyn. She instinctively lowered her gaze again, expecting the distance between a king and an omega to remain unchanged. Instead, something happened that no elder, noble, or warrior had imagined possible. Without the slightest trace of hesitation, Lucian lowered himself onto one knee beside her upon the cold stone. Gasps swept through Moonfall Square. The Alpha King did not kneel because tradition demanded it. He knelt because his own heart had made its decision long before anyone else understood the truth. His voice remained low enough for Evelyn alone, yet quiet enough that every person nearby could still hear. "No one who has carried the burdens of others with this much grace should ever believe she stands alone." He gently rested one hand over his own heart in a gesture of respect rather than authority. "If this square believes your dignity belongs beneath theirs," he said, "then I will stand with your dignity by kneeling beside you first." In that single unforgettable moment, the meaning of strength changed before the eyes of the entire pack. The sound of astonished breaths swept across Moonfall Square like a sudden gust before complete silence returned. No one could remember a ruler lowering himself before an omega, much less one who had stood alone beneath years of quiet judgment. Evelyn stared at Lucian in disbelief, her thoughts struggling to catch up with the moment unfolding before her. "Your Majesty," she whispered, almost pleading, "please. You do not have to do this." Lucian offered the faintest smile, calm and steady. "Yes," he answered. "I do." He rose gracefully and extended his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. After a brief hesitation, Evelyn placed her trembling hand in his. He helped her to her feet with such natural respect that the gesture seemed effortless, yet it carried more weight than any speech delivered that afternoon. For the first time in years, Evelyn stood eye to eye with the crowd instead of beneath it. Lucian slowly turned toward the elders. 3 years ago, he said, I disappeared during a violent storm while traveling through the northern forest. My guards searched for me until dawn. They believed I had survived alone. Confused expressions spread throughout the gathering. Lucian continued. They were mistaken. His silver-gray eyes rested briefly upon Evelyn before returning to the crowd. A young woman found an injured stranger she did not recognize. She gave away her own blanket on a freezing night. She shared the last piece of food she carried after walking nearly 8 miles through heavy rain. She treated a wound with strips torn from her own cloak. Then she walked away before sunrise without asking for my name, my title, or a single reward. Evelyn's eyes widened. The forgotten memory rushed back with startling clarity. The storm, the horse, the quiet traveler. She looked at Lucian as though seeing him for the first time. That was, she breathed. Lucian nodded gently. It was me. A wave of stunned whispers rolled through the square. Elder Magnus lowered his eyes. Lady Vivian's confident posture faltered. The Alpha King continued in the same composed voice. I searched for the woman who saved my life because gratitude deserves action, not memory alone. Instead, I discovered that while the Northern Territories honored me as their ruler, the woman who had expected nothing in return was being treated as though her compassion had no value. He let the words settle before speaking again. The strongest act I witnessed during that storm was not mine. It was hers. Evelyn struggled to find words. I only helped someone who needed help, she said quietly. Lucian looked at her with unmistakable respect. Exactly, he replied. You believed a stranger deserved kindness before you knew whether he deserved your trust. That choice revealed more about your character than any ceremony ever could. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd gently wiped tears from her eyes. Parents exchanged thoughtful glances with their children. Young wolves who had repeated careless rumors now looked upon Evelyn with growing shame and newfound admiration. What had once been dismissed as ordinary kindness suddenly appeared extraordinary because everyone realized how rarely they had practiced it themselves. Lucian turned back toward the assembled pack. A community is not measured by how it celebrates the powerful, he said. It is measured by how faithfully it recognizes goodness when it appears in quiet places. As those words echoed across the ancient square, the story everyone believed about Evelyn Carter began to disappear, replaced by a truth that had been waiting patiently for 3 long years to be seen. No one spoke after Lucian's final words because there was nothing left to defend. The carefully repeated assumptions that had shaped Iron Ridge for years had collapsed beneath the weight of simple truth. Elder Magnus slowly removed the carved medallion that marked his authority as head of the council. His shoulders, once carried with unwavering certainty, now seemed burdened by the realization that tradition without compassion had become something entirely different from justice. He lowered his head toward the Alpha King. Your Majesty, he said quietly. The council failed to see what stood before us for many years. We judged by expectation instead of character. For that failure, I accept full responsibility. Lucian regarded him with calm eyes. Responsibility is meaningful only when it is followed by change, he replied. Every law exists to protect the people, not to diminish them. When customs forget that purpose, leaders must remember it. Elder Magnus nodded slowly, understanding the difference. He turned toward the assembled council members. Effective immediately, he announced, the judgment against Evelyn Carter is withdrawn. All official records declaring her unworthy are to be removed from the archives. The council will conduct a complete review of every decision that has treated status as more important than service. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. It was not outrage. It was relief. Lady Vivian remained motionless, her confident expression replaced by thoughtful silence. She had always believed prestige guaranteed respect, yet the entire square had just witnessed respect being earned by humility instead of position. She stepped forward and met Evelyn's eyes for the first time without pride standing between them. I allowed reputation to become more important than truth, she admitted. I cannot change the years that have passed, but I can acknowledge that I was wrong. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment before offering the same gentle kindness she had shown strangers throughout her life. Then let today become the beginning of something better, she answered softly. The simplicity of her response surprised everyone listening. She had every opportunity to seek revenge through humiliation, yet she chose dignity instead. Lucian noticed the reaction spreading across the square. Children watched closely as their parents lowered their eyes in quiet reflection. Young warriors who had once measured strength by rank now witnessed forgiveness requiring far greater courage than pride ever could. The Alpha King stepped beside Evelyn, not ahead of her and not behind her, but as an equal in the moment that mattered most. Let this gathering remember what happened here today, he said. Not because mistakes were exposed, but because hearts proved capable of changing. A pack grows stronger whenever truth is welcomed instead of feared. One by one, members of Iron Ridge stepped forward to greet Evelyn by her name rather than the labels they had used for years. Mrs. Harper embraced her hands with grateful tears. The schoolteacher smiled warmly. The farmer who had once remained silent thanked her openly before his children. The distance that had separated Evelyn from her community slowly disappeared, replaced by something she had almost forgotten could exist. It was not admiration that filled Moonfall Square. It was belonging. As the afternoon sunlight finally broke through the gray clouds above the ancient village, its warm rays settled across the weathered stone where only moments earlier shame had stood. Now that same place had become a reminder that justice begins the moment someone has the courage to see another person as they truly are. The sun lingered above the western hills, as though even daylight had chosen to witness the ending of a story that would be remembered for generations. The cold Judgment Square no longer felt like a place of condemnation. It had become a place where truth quietly reclaimed its voice. Evelyn stood beside Lucian, still trying to understand how a single afternoon had transformed years of loneliness into something she had never expected to receive. She looked across the familiar faces surrounding her. They were the same people she had greeted every morning, the same neighbors she had helped through storms, harsh winters, and difficult harvests. Nothing about them had changed, yet everything had. For the first time, they were truly seeing her. Lucian glanced toward the ancient stone platform where judgments had been delivered for centuries. Every generation inherits traditions, he said, his calm voice carrying across the peaceful square. The question is whether we preserve their wisdom or merely repeat their mistakes. No one interrupted him. Even the children listened with unusual attention. Today, he continued, Iron Ridge has chosen something greater than pride. It has chosen understanding. That choice will protect this pack long after every one of us becomes part of its history. Elder Magnus bowed his head in agreement. The remaining council members followed without hesitation, not because they were ordered to, but because they recognized that respect could no longer belong only to titles. It belonged equally to integrity. Lucian then turned toward Evelyn once more. There was no ceremony prepared, no musicians waiting, and no carefully rehearsed proclamation. Only sincerity remained. He extended his hand again with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning. Evelyn Carter, he said, the Northern Territories need people whose character remains steady when recognition is absent. I cannot change the years that were taken from you, but I hope the years ahead will finally reflect the worth you have carried all along. Evelyn looked at his offered hand before meeting his eyes. She smiled, small but genuine, the kind of smile that appeared only after hope had survived every reason to disappear. She accepted his hand, not because a king had offered it, but because she recognized the kindness behind the gesture. Together they stepped away from the judgment platform, walking side by side through the center of Moonfall Square. As they passed, the wolves of Iron Ridge slowly lowered their heads, not in fear, but in respect freely given. The little girl who had earlier asked why Evelyn was alone tugged gently on her father's sleeve again. She is not alone anymore, the child whispered with a smile. Her father looked toward Evelyn and nodded. No, he answered softly, and perhaps she never truly was. The afternoon breeze carried away the last of the gray clouds, revealing a wide blue sky stretching above the village. Warm sunlight reflected across the ancient stones where one person had once been asked to carry shame alone. Now those same stones reflected something entirely different. They reminded every wolf who crossed them that true strength did not begin with power, status, or applause. It began with choosing compassion when no one was watching, offering kindness without expecting reward, and refusing to let another person's dignity be forgotten. Years later, travelers passing through Iron Ridge would still hear the story of the quiet Omega and the Alpha King, who changed an entire pack without raising his voice. They would remember that the greatest leaders did not stand taller by making others kneel. They stood taller by lifting others back to their feet. And whenever the autumn wind swept across Moonfall Square, it carried with it the same enduring truth that had transformed one unforgettable day. True strength is gentle, and the kindest heart often leaves the deepest legacy.